When people think of the origins of history as a discipline, one name rises above all others: Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Born around 484 BC, Herodotus lived at a time when the Greek world was beginning to expand its horizons. Athens had defeated Persia at Marathon and Salamis, and Greek merchants, soldiers, and adventurers were exploring lands that lay far beyond the familiar shores of the Aegean. Herodotus traveled widely himself, collecting stories from Egypt, Babylon, the Persian Empire, and even the fringes of India. He wrote them all down in a massive work known as the Histories. But Herodotus was not a modern historian. He did not separate fact from rumor with rigorous analysis. Instead, he preserved everything he heard, from military campaigns and political speeches to bizarre local customs and incredible natural wonders. His book is part history, part travelogue, and part collection of folklore. This is what makes him so fascinating to us today. He gives us not only the events of the ancient world, but also the mindset of the people who lived in it. And among his many strange and colorful stories, one stands out as particularly bizarre. It is the tale of the gold-digging ants. According to Herodotus, deep in the eastern satrapies of the Persian Empire, there was a sandy desert rich in gold dust. Living there were giant ants, larger than foxes, though smaller than dogs. These ants, while digging their burrows, brought gold-bearing sand to the surface. The locals, Herodotus said, would take advantage of this by rushing into the desert during the heat of the day when the ants were less active to gather up the gold dust. But it was dangerous work, because if the ants noticed intruders, they would chase them down with incredible speed and ferocity. For the Greeks of the 5th century BC, this was not merely a curious story. It was a symbol of the wonders and riches of the East. The Persian Empire, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley, was already associated with luxury, wealth, and strange creatures unknown in the Mediterranean world. To say that the Persians had ants that literally unearthed gold seemed, to Herodotus's audience, both believable and a natural extension of what they imagined the East to be. From a modern perspective, of course, the story seems absurd. Ants larger than foxes? Insects that dig up gold? It sounds like a fantasy from a medieval bestiary rather than a serious account of the world, and yet Herodotus reports it with a straight face. He even places the story in a geographic context, saying it came from the lands north of India, in a region of desert and mountains. He insists that his source for the story was the Persians themselves, not some passing rumor. This raises an important question. Why did Herodotus include such a tale? Was he gullible, simply writing down whatever he heard? Was he deliberately entertaining his audience with marvels, mixing fact with fantasy? Or could it be that there was a kernel of truth behind the story, a real phenomenon that became distorted through translation and retelling? Over the centuries, scholars and scientists have tried to make sense of this riddle. Some dismissed it as pure myth. Others tried to rationalize it, suggesting that Herodotus was misinformed or that a word was mistranslated. In modern times, one explanation has gained popularity: that Herodotus was actually describing the behavior of Himalayan marmots, large burrowing animals that, in the process of digging their burrows, bring up soil that contains gold dust. The Persians, observing this, might have told the story to Herodotus, and in the process, the word for marmot was confused with the word for ant. But before we get ahead of ourselves, it's important to understand the intellectual world in which Herodotus lived. The Greeks of his time believed in a world filled with strange races and creatures beyond the edges of their maps. From the dog-headed men of India to the one-eyed Aramospians who fought griffins over gold, the imagination of the ancient world was vivid and unrestrained. For Herodotus, including such tales was not necessarily a mark of foolishness. Rather, it was part of his attempt to record everything he encountered, both what seemed credible and what seemed fantastical. And that is what makes the story of the gold-digging ants so powerful even today. It is not just a piece of curious folklore. It is a window into how ancient peoples thought about the world. It tells us about the boundaries of knowledge in the 5th century BC, about the interaction between Greeks and Persians, and about the human tendency to blur the line between fact and legend. So, in this documentary, we are going to peel back the layers of this mystery. First, we'll examine the historical context, what the world looked like to Herodotus and his readers. Then we'll dive into the story itself as he told it, analyzing the details and their possible meaning. After that, we'll explore the modern theories, marmots, mistranslations, and the real geology of the regions Herodotus described. And finally, we'll consider what this story means for us today, why myths survive, why humans are drawn to tales of wonder, and what it says about the very nature of history itself. The gold-digging ants of Herodotus may never have existed in the way he described them, but they live on in our imagination, precisely because they stand at the crossroads of history and myth. And as we explore them, we will find not only the truth behind a bizarre ancient story, but also insights into the way human beings make sense of a world that is always stranger, richer, and more surprising than we can imagine. So, let's begin by stepping into the shoes of Herodotus, the traveler, the storyteller, the historian, who looked out at the wide world and asked what marvels lie beyond the horizon.
When we read Herodotus' story about the gold-digging ants, it might sound fantastical, almost like a piece of folklore. But to understand why such a story took hold, we need to step back into the world of the 5th century BCE. This was an age when maps were crude, travel was limited, and much of the world remained shrouded in rumor. For a Greek audience, distant lands like Persia and India were places of mystery, wonder, and unimaginable wealth. Herodotus himself lived during a turbulent time, when Greece was both threatened and inspired by the mighty Persian Empire. Persia stretched farther than any empire before it, from the shores of Asia Minor to the banks of the Indus River, and from Egypt up into the rugged mountains of Central Asia. It was a vast mosaic of cultures, languages, and landscapes. For Greeks who had only recently repelled the Persian invasions in the famous battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, Persia represented both a looming danger and an irresistible source of curiosity. India, in particular, stood on the outer edges of Greek geographical imagination. Few Greeks had ever been there. Most information about India came through Persian intermediaries, since large parts of the subcontinent were under Persian control or influence. As a result, everything the Greeks knew was filtered through multiple layers of interpretation, translation, and rumor. This is crucial to keep in mind when we consider Herodotus' story. According to him, the land beyond Persia, near India, contained deserts rich in gold dust. But there was a problem. The gold was guarded not by men, but by enormous ants. These ants, Herodotus says, were bigger than foxes, but smaller than dogs, and they dug up the sand in search of food. In the process, gold dust would be left on the surface. Local tribes would then dash in to collect the precious material, often chased by the ferocious creatures. To a Greek audience, this was exactly the kind of tale that captured the exotic flavor of distant lands. After all, if Persia was already strange and overwhelming, how much stranger must India be? Let's consider the context. By the mid-5th century BCE, Greek knowledge of the world was expanding, but it was still deeply limited. Most Greeks thought of the Earth as a flat disk surrounded by ocean. Beyond familiar cities and coastlines, geography dissolved into myth. The farther you went, the stranger things became: men with dog heads, lands where the sun barely set, and rivers of honey or milk. Herodotus' description of giant ants fit neatly into this worldview. It is also important to recognize how Herodotus framed his work. He did not claim that every story he recorded was true. Instead, he gathered accounts from travelers, merchants, soldiers, and locals, and then presented them, often noting, "I cannot say if this is true, but this is what I was told." This makes him less a scientist and more a cultural collector, a man archiving the beliefs and reports of his age. Now, why gold? Because gold was the ultimate symbol of wealth and power in the ancient world. For the Greeks, Persia was almost synonymous with golden riches, golden thrones, golden cups, and treasuries overflowing with precious metals. Linking India to gold made perfect sense, since it lay even farther beyond Persia. By telling his readers that giant ants dug up gold dust in India, Herodotus was weaving together two themes: the natural wealth of distant lands and the sense that such wealth was guarded by strange and dangerous forces. This was also a moral story. To Greeks, wealth always came with risk. Heroes in mythology often faced dragons or monsters guarding treasure. In this sense, the gold-digging ants were like a living mythological obstacle, real creatures instead of dragons, but serving the same symbolic role. But from the Persian perspective, there may have been a grain of truth behind the tale. Later writers and modern scholars suggest that Herodotus may have misunderstood reports from Persian sources. In some regions of the Persian Empire, particularly around modern-day Afghanistan, small animals like marmots dig up the earth while burrowing. Their digging brings gold-rich soil to the surface. Local tribes would collect the gold dust that appeared in these burrows. Through mistranslation or exaggeration, these marmots may have been described as mountain ants in Persian. By the time this story reached Herodotus, the creatures had transformed into giant, dangerous beasts. But to a Greek audience, this didn't matter. What mattered was the image, a desert filled with riches, but guarded by bizarre and hostile creatures. It was a story that fired the imagination, blending geography, natural history, and myth into one. So when we talk about the world of Herodotus, we must picture a fragile boundary between fact and legend. This was not an age of precise maps and scientific verification. It was an age when knowledge expanded outward like ripples in water, with each ripple blending reality with hearsay. Persia and India were lands both feared and admired, places where the Greeks projected their fantasies of wealth, strangeness, and danger. In short, Herodotus' tale of the gold-digging ants reflects more than just curiosity. It reveals how Greeks perceived the edges of the known world as lands of wonder, where treasure lay waiting, but always behind a veil of mystery and peril.
Now that we have set the stage by understanding Herodotus' world, let us turn directly to his account of the gold-digging ants themselves. The passage occurs in Book 3 of the Histories, where Herodotus is describing the wealth and peoples of the Persian Empire, especially those living on the borders near India. According to Herodotus, there existed a sandy desert beyond Persia, near the land of the Indians, where gold lay scattered beneath the surface. The land itself was harsh and arid, almost impossible to cross. But there, he tells us, lived strange creatures that made it both dangerous and wondrous. Herodotus writes that in this region, quote, "there are ants, not as large as dogs, but bigger than foxes. These ants burrowed into the sand, tossing up the earth as they dug. The sand, however, was unlike ordinary soil. It was full of gold dust. The locals, Herodotus says, knew this and sought to take advantage of it, but the ants were ferocious defenders of their territory." He explains that the tribes living nearby would plan expeditions to harvest the gold dust. The process, as he describes it, was almost like a raid or a military operation. The people would wait until the heat of the day, when the ants retreated underground to escape the blazing sun. Then, moving quickly, the tribesmen would bring their camels, animals especially suited to desert travel, and rush into the territory of the ants. They would scoop up as much gold-bearing sand as they could, load their camels, and flee before the ants emerged again. Herodotus adds a vivid detail. The camels they used were female, and the riders would place their young calves at the rear of the caravan. Why? Because the mother camels, hearing their young cry, would run faster toward them, ensuring the caravan escaped the pursuing ants. The image is striking. A desperate dash across the desert, camels weighed down with sacks of golden sand, while hordes of giant, furious ants burst from the earth in pursuit. This description had everything to capture the imagination of a Greek audience. First, it spoke of unimaginable riches, gold not mined from deep shafts, but lying almost on the surface of the desert. Second, it included exotic animals, like camels, which were rare and strange to Greeks. Finally, it contained the dramatic threat of monstrous creatures, neither entirely mythical nor familiar, but somewhere in between. For Herodotus, this story was part of a larger theme. Throughout the histories, he emphasized the wealth of distant lands and the hardships required to obtain it. Whether it was Egyptian gold, Babylonian treasures, or Scythian horses, every land seemed to offer something wondrous, but also dangerous. The gold-digging ants were, in a sense, India's contribution to this tapestry of marvels. We might pause and ask, did Herodotus himself believe this story? That is difficult to answer. He was often cautious when reporting tales that seemed unbelievable. Sometimes he would say, "This is what the Persians tell, though I myself do not vouch for it." In the case of the gold-digging ants, he does not explicitly cast doubt. Instead, he simply relays the account in detail, as though it were factual. To his audience, it likely did not matter whether the ants were real or not. What mattered was the sense of wonder, the idea that somewhere beyond the edges of the known world, creatures and riches existed that defied ordinary experience. The story of the gold-digging ants also fits into a larger pattern of ancient literature. Many cultures placed fabulous creatures as guardians of treasure. In Greek mythology, dragons often guarded golden hoards, like the dragon that watched over the golden fleece, or the serpent that protected the golden apples of the Hesperides. In Near Eastern traditions, too, monsters and strange animals stood as obstacles between men and wealth. Herodotus's ants may not have been dragons, but they fulfilled the same symbolic role. Wealth never comes freely, it is always defended. Yet Herodotus's account was not just a myth. Later evidence suggests he may have been reporting in distorted form a real phenomenon. Scholars believe he confused ants with marmots, burrowing animals common in the mountainous regions of Afghanistan and Tibet. These marmots, as they dig, naturally bring up soil that sometimes contains gold dust. Local tribes did indeed collect this gold. In the Old Persian language, the word for mountain ant may have been used metaphorically for these marmots, and when this was translated into Greek, Herodotus and his audience imagined literal giant ants. Regardless of its factual basis, the story endured. Other ancient writers, such as Pliny the Elder centuries later, repeated Herodotus's account. Even Alexander the Great, during his famous campaigns in India, seems to have heard tales of strange creatures guarding gold. The myth spread and persisted, blending fact, mistranslation, and imagination into one unforgettable narrative. In Herodotus's time, though, the power of this story lay in its ability to evoke a world beyond the ordinary. For a Greek listener in the 5th century BCE, sitting perhaps in Athens after the Persian Wars, the tale of gold-digging ants was not just entertainment, it was a window into the mystery of the East. Lands of wealth, danger, and strangeness that stood at the edge of the known world.
Herodotus's tale of the gold-digging ants may sound fantastical to our ears, almost like something from a legend or fairy tale. But before we dismiss it as pure invention, it is worth asking, Could there be a kernel of truth behind the story? Might the Greeks, through a chain of translation errors and cultural misunderstandings, have been describing something real? Modern historians and zoologists have tried to answer these questions, and the results are fascinating. One of the most persuasive theories points to marmots, burrowing rodents native to Central Asia, particularly the high plateaus of the Himalayas and the deserts of modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Tibet. Marmots, like ants, dig extensive burrows. As they excavate the soil, they bring material to the surface. In some regions, this soil contains flecks of gold dust. Local tribes, especially in the region known today as Ladakh, Tibet, and northern Pakistan, were known to collect the soil from marmot burrows, wash it, and retrieve gold. This practice has been observed well into modern times. In fact, French ethnologist Michel Payssel, during expeditions in the 20th century, witnessed nomads in Tibet gathering gold-bearing soil from marmot burrows in a process that sounded eerily similar to Herodotus's description. So where did the ants come from? The answer may lie in language. In Old Persian, there was a word used to describe both ant and marmot. When stories of these creatures were passed from Persian informants to Greek ears, the term may have been translated literally as ant. Imagine a Greek scribe hearing a Persian trader say, "These mountain ants dig burrows that uncover gold." Without familiarity with marmots, the Greek listener would naturally assume the story referred to giant insects. This would explain why Herodotus insists the creatures were bigger than foxes but smaller than dogs, sizes that match marmots far better than any insect. His description of their burrowing, their aggressive nature, and the gold-bearing soil they exposed also fits perfectly with the behavior of marmots. The final flourish, armies of furious ants chasing men on camels, may be an embellishment, or perhaps a way to emphasize the danger and difficulty of collecting the gold. In reality, marmots might be territorial and bite if disturbed, but they are hardly capable of chasing caravans across the desert. Yet in the process of storytelling, such details easily grow exaggerated, turning natural animals into near mythical beasts. But let us not dismiss the myth too quickly. Even if the marmot theory provides a rational explanation, the story still served a symbolic role. To the Greeks, the ants were not simply animals. They embodied the principle that wealth comes at great risk. The farther one traveled from the Mediterranean world, the more dangerous and marvelous the creatures became. Just as the Scythians lived in a land of endless grass and horsemen, so the Indians inhabited deserts with golden sand and monstrous ants. Interestingly, the gold-digging ants also resemble other creatures in world mythology. In some Indian epics, such as the Mahabharata, there are tales of great ants that dug into the earth to release treasures. Persian traditions, too, speak of burrowing animals that brought precious metals to light. It is possible that Herodotus' story is a blending of several cultural myths circulating along the trade routes that connected Greece, Persia, and India. The persistence of the story suggests that it satisfied a deep fascination. Later writers like Pliny the Elder repeated the tale without skepticism. Even in the medieval period, travelers' accounts often included strange gold-guarding creatures, whether ants, griffins, or dragons. To audiences unfamiliar with the realities of distant lands, these stories provided a way to imagine the wealth of the East as both alluring and perilous. Modern archaeology and linguistics allow us to peel back the layers of this myth. The marmot explanation is compelling, but it does not eliminate the power of the original story. If anything, it highlights how cultural misunderstandings can create legends. A simple detail lost in translation, marmots mistaken for ants, was enough to transform a practical mining technique into a myth that lasted for centuries. Thus, the gold-digging ants remind us of an important lesson. Myths are not often pure invention. They are hybrids, woven from real observations, distorted language, and the human tendency to amplify the marvelous. Behind every ancient tale, there may lie a fragment of truth, waiting for us to rediscover it. To fully grasp why Herodotus's tale of gold-digging ants captured the imagination of the ancient world, we need to step back and consider the role of gold itself in early civilizations. Why was this single metal so prized that people were willing to believe in armies of monstrous ants guarding it? Gold has a unique quality. Unlike iron, which rusts, or bronze, which corrodes, gold resists decay. It shines as brightly today as it did thousands of years ago. For ancient peoples, this permanence gave gold a mystical aura. It seemed untouched by time, immune to the forces that wore down everything else. The sunlight glow of gold made it an object of worship as much as of wealth. In Egypt, for example, gold was closely associated with the gods, particularly the sun god Ra. Pharaohs were often buried with vast amounts of it, not only as a display of wealth, but as a material that could accompany them into the afterlife. In Mesopotamia, gold was reserved for temples and idols, reinforcing its sacred character. Across the ancient Mediterranean, gold functioned as both currency and spiritual symbol. By the time of Herodotus, in the 5th century BCE, gold had also become essential for empires. Persia, the great superpower of the age, built much of its wealth on gold. Tribute from conquered peoples often came in the form of bullion or coinage. The Greeks themselves measured their success by their access to precious metals, whether mined in Thrace, Macedonia, or imported through trade. But gold was not evenly distributed across the ancient world. Some lands were rich in it, while others had very little. This uneven distribution created a hunger for stories. If one's homeland lacked gold, then tales of faraway deserts where the very soil glittered with treasure became irresistible. Such stories explained how great kings amassed their wealth, and why distant regions were worth conquering or trading with. The ants of India, then, symbolized the mystery of supply. They represented the idea that in the farthest reaches of the earth, nature itself seemed to generate wealth. Just as griffins were said to guard gold in the mountains of Scythia, so ants supposedly protected the treasures of the East. To Greek listeners, this reinforced the sense that gold was both a natural wonder and a divine gift, something never easily obtained, always requiring risk and courage. When we set Herodotus's story against this background, it becomes clearer why it resonated so strongly. The ants were more than just strange animals. They were guardians of the most precious material of the ancient world. To say that tribes ventured into deserts to steal gold from them was to tell a story about human ambition, greed, and the lengths people would go to achieve wealth. And here lies another truth. Gold shaped geopolitics. Empires rose and fell depending on their control of precious metals. Athens, for instance, built its navy, the force that would defeat Persia at Salamis, using silver mined from Laurium. Rome later fueled its expansion with gold taken from Spain. Control of mines was as crucial as control of farmland. In that sense, Herodotus's ants remind us of the invisible struggle for resources that underlay so much of ancient history. Even in India and Persia, where Herodotus placed his tale, gold was a key driver of trade. Caravans carried it along the early routes that would later form the Silk Road. It paid for spices, textiles, horses, and weapons. The wealth of kings depended not only on armies and agriculture, but on their ability to tap into the glittering veins of the earth. Thus, the legend of gold-digging ants was not a random curiosity. It reflected the central obsession of ancient peoples, the pursuit of resources that seemed both earthly and divine. The fact that the story endured for centuries is a testament to how powerfully gold shaped the imagination. So when we hear of Herodotus's ants, we should not laugh them off as nonsense. Instead, we should see them as symbols, guardians of the most precious material of the ancient world. They remind us that wealth was never simply about numbers or trade. It was about myths, symbols, and the belief that somewhere beyond the horizon, in lands of mystery, lay the treasures that could change the fate of kings.
The story of gold-digging ants did not vanish with Herodotus. Instead, it lived on for centuries, retold, reimagined, and reshaped by later writers who saw in it a tale too marvelous to abandon. One of the earliest to echo Herodotus was Ctesias of Cnidus, a Greek physician at the Persian court in the 5th century BCE. Ctesias often wrote about India, though his accounts were filled with fantastic creatures, dog-headed men, giant roosters, rivers of honey. In his version, the gold-digging ants were confirmed as real, smaller than dogs but larger than foxes. Ctesias claimed they guarded desert sands that glimmered with treasure. His writing shows that the myth was already becoming detached from geography and turning into something closer to folklore. Later, in the 1st century CE, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder included the ants in his monumental work, Naturalis Historia. Pliny repeated the story almost as fact, though with some caution. He explained how the creatures dug into the ground, exposing grains of gold, which local tribesmen would then steal. To Pliny, this was one of many wonders of India, a land that, for Romans, represented the farthest edge of the known world. The tale traveled further in the Middle Ages, carried by merchants, travelers, and compilers of marvels. Medieval bestiaries, books that mixed natural science with symbolism, included strange creatures from distant lands. In some versions, the ants became dragons or griffins, conflating multiple myths of gold-guarding beasts. In others, the ants were said to live in deserts so hot that only the bravest could approach them, adding layers of danger and heroism. By the time of the Islamic Golden Age, the story had found new life in Arabic and Persian writings. Scholars, such as al-Biruni, referenced unusual animals of India, sometimes merging Herodotus ants with real creatures like marmots. Travelers like Marco Polo in the 13th century even mentioned golden sands guarded by beasts, though he did not insist they were ants. Instead, the motif of treasure protected by nature became part of a broader tapestry of travel lore. What is striking is how the story adapted to each new cultural context. For Greeks, it explained the exotic wealth of Persia and India. For Romans, it symbolized the wonders of a world beyond their empire. For medieval Europeans, it became a moral lesson about greed and danger. For Islamic scholars, it blended with zoological curiosity and local lore. The ants also appeared in map-making and cartography. Medieval maps of the world, Mappe Mundi, often placed strange creatures at the edges of the earth. The inclusion of gold-digging ants alongside cyclopses, dog-headed men, and giant birds reveals how powerful the story remained as a symbol of the unknown East. But why did the tale endure so long? One reason is that it provided an explanation for a very real phenomenon: the extraordinary wealth of India. Gold and precious gems flowed into the Mediterranean from the east, but to those who never traveled there, the means of extraction were a mystery. Instead of miners, they imagined monsters. Instead of ordinary labor, they pictured adventure and danger. The ants were a metaphor for the costs of wealth. One could obtain gold, but only by risking one's life. Another reason was that the story was simply too good to abandon. Humans have always loved marvels, especially when they come from faraway lands. A tale that combined animals, treasure, and peril was irresistible.
It echoed the myth of the dragon guarding its hoard, or the griffins of Scythia defending golden mountains. These archetypes were universal, and Herodotus's ants fit perfectly into them. Even as the Renaissance dawned and knowledge of the natural world expanded, the myth did not entirely disappear. Some early modern writers still mentioned the ants in compendiums of exotic wonders. Gradually, though, the growth of scientific inquiry pushed the story into the realm of legend. Scholars began to suggest rational explanations, such as the Himalayan marmots that cast up soil rich in gold dust while burrowing. And yet, even as zoologists demystified the tale, its symbolic power remained. Writers and poets continued to invoke the ants as emblems of greed, wonder, or the unreachable riches of the earth. In short, the gold-digging ants of Herodotus survived because they were more than just animals. They were a story about human longing for wealth, for mystery, for the edges of the world where the ordinary rules no longer applied. From Greece to Rome, from medieval monasteries to Islamic scholars, from explorers to poets, the ants marched on, immortalized not in deserts, but in imagination.
Today, when we look back at Herodotus's tale of gold-digging ants, it's tempting to dismiss it as pure fantasy. But modern scholars, historians, and scientists have worked hard to uncover what kernel of truth might lie behind the story. Surprisingly, their efforts suggest that Herodotus may not have been as far off as we once thought. The most widely accepted explanation comes from the Himalayan marmot, a large, ground-dwelling rodent that inhabits the high-altitude plateaus of Tibet, Ladakh, and surrounding regions. Marmots, like ants, live in burrows and constantly dig into the soil, pushing dirt to the surface. In some regions of the Himalayas, that soil contains flakes of gold. When marmots dig their tunnels, they bring gold-rich sand to the surface, where it glitters in the sun. French ethnologist Michel Payssel conducted fieldwork in the late 20th century and found that local people in the Himalayas collected gold dust from marmot mounds. Payssel proposed that when Persian traders and soldiers heard of this practice, the details became distorted as the story passed westward. By the time it reached Herodotus, the marmots had turned into giant ants. The linguistic trail even supports this theory. The Old Persian word for marmot may have sounded similar to the word for mountain ant. A simple mistranslation could have transformed rodents into insects. This explanation fits remarkably well with Herodotus's details. He described the creatures as bigger than a fox, smaller than a dog, a perfect description of a marmot. He also claimed they lived in sandy deserts high in the east where gold dust could be collected, a clear reference to Himalayan or Tibetan landscapes. In short, Herodotus's sources may have been telling the truth, but their story lost accuracy as it crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries. Other scholars suggest different interpretations. Some argue that Herodotus's informants may have deliberately exaggerated the story to impress or mislead him. After all, tales of monstrous creatures guarding treasure were a common motif in many cultures. By describing wealth as protected by danger, storytellers heightened its value. Another possibility is that the ants were metaphors rather than literal creatures. In many traditions, ants symbolized tireless labor, community, and endless digging. The image of ants unearthing gold might have been a poetic way of describing miners or tribespeople who worked the land, like swarms of insects. When transmitted across languages and generations, metaphor hardened into zoology, and metaphorical ants became monstrous ones. Modern science also sheds light on why such stories were so believable in antiquity. Ancient observers had limited opportunities to verify reports from distant lands. Travel was slow, and information often moved through traders and mercenaries who had incentives to tell astonishing tales. To people in Greece, Persia, or Rome, the Himalayas were as distant and mysterious as another planet. A creature that dug up gold was no more unbelievable than a crocodile or a giraffe.
Interestingly, the idea of animals exposing valuable minerals is not unique to Herodotus's ants. In parts of Africa, elephants digging for salt create pits that later reveal mineral deposits. In the Americas, beavers and prairie dogs change entire landscapes through their burrowing. The concept of wealth revealed by animals, then, has a real ecological basis, even if the specific details were mythologized. Modern archaeology also reveals how important stories like this were for shaping ancient geography. Herodotus's ants contributed to the enduring idea that the East, India, Persia, and beyond, was a land of unimaginable riches. This myth fueled trade, conquest, and exploration for centuries. Even when Europeans set sail for Asia in the Age of Discovery, echoes of these ancient marvels influenced their expectations. In recent years, the story has even attracted attention from scientists outside the humanities. Biologists interested in marmot behavior note how often burrowing animals accidentally expose mineral-rich soil. Anthropologists study how myths preserve fragments of truth across generations, even when details become distorted. Linguists examine how a single mistranslated word can give birth to an entire legend. The modern consensus is that Herodotus did not invent his tale, nor was he necessarily gullible. Instead, he was faithfully recording what he had heard from Persian sources. Those sources were describing a real phenomenon: gold-bearing soil brought up by marmots. Somewhere along the line, marmots became ants, and careful observations were embellished with drama. The result was one of the most enduring myths of the ancient world. And yet, the power of the story goes beyond zoology or linguistics. It reminds us how humans make sense of the unknown. When faced with something strange or distant, we fill in the gaps with imagination. We create creatures larger than life, guardians of wealth, obstacles to greed. In this sense, the gold-digging ants are timeless, not because they exist, but because they embody the way human beings tell stories about the world. In short, modern explanations do not destroy the myth, they enrich it. They show how a tale that once seemed absurd may actually contain a distorted memory of real practices and real landscapes. The ants may have been marmots, the desert may have been the Himalayas, and the gold may have been dust in the soil. But the story, passed down from millennia, remains just as captivating today as it was when Herodotus first wrote it down.
As we reach the end of this journey, we can see that Herodotus' story of the gold-digging ants is far more than a curious myth. It is a window into the human imagination, into the way knowledge travels, and into the blending of truth and legend that defines much of ancient history. On one level, the tale may have begun with nothing more mysterious than marmots digging in the gold-rich soils of the Himalayas. A simple natural phenomenon, retold across cultures and languages, grew into a story of giant ants jealously guarding treasures in the desert. Each retelling added new details. Each generation of listeners demanded greater wonder. By the time it reached the Greek world, it had transformed into a legend powerful enough to echo across millennia. On another level, the story speaks to something universal. Humans are storytellers by nature. When we encounter the unknown, we shape it into a narrative. Gold guarded by animals becomes a metaphor for the costs of wealth. The idea that great riches are never found without great risk. Myths like this one are not simply false, they're symbolic truths, encoding warnings, values, and hopes that transcend their literal meaning. It also reminds us how fragile truth can be when carried across distance and time. A mistranslated word, a misunderstood description, or an embellished anecdote can turn marmots into monsters. Yet this transformation does not make the story worthless, it makes it richer. Because in the end, history is not only about facts, but about the way humans interpret and retell those facts. Herodotus's ants also show us the interconnectedness of ancient civilizations. From India to Persia, from Persia to Greece, from Greece to the entire Western tradition, this story traveled and evolved. In doing so, it demonstrates how ideas, like gold itself, circulate through human networks, taking on new forms as they move. And perhaps that is why this tale still captivates us today. It is not about whether giant ants really existed. It is about curiosity, the human hunger to explore, to explain, to imagine. It is about the blurred boundary between reality and myth, and about the enduring power of a story well told. So the next time you hear a legend that sounds unbelievable, remember the gold-digging ants. Behind even the wildest tales, there may be a grain of truth, carried across centuries like a nugget of gold hidden in the sand. And that is why Herodotus's ants matter, not because they were real, but because they show us how stories themselves become treasures, passed down from one generation to the next, glimmering with wonder in the light of history.